When you hear about economic growth in news, people often refer to these things called GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and while that might sound complex, the concept is actually pretty simple. If you added it up, the value of all the goods and all the services produced in a country over a specific period of time, say a year, the result would be GDP. Or equivalently, if you added up all the incomes earned by people in a country over the course of the year, that would be GDP too. GDP is one way of measuring the size of country's economy and judging whether the economy is growing over time. So the citizens of a country with high GDP are likely to have high income and high standards of living. And if GDP goes up a lot, people are likely to be earning and spending more, and business are likely to be hiring and investing more. In other words, people are likely to be feeling better off. On the other hand, if GDP growth is weak or perhaps even falling, companies are likely to be cutting jobs and people are likely to be earning and spending less, leaving them feeling worse off. Clearly, GDP isn't that all matters in life. GDP doesn't measure a whole raft of things that improve our well-being, like spending time with their families or living in a clean and safe environment. Nonetheless, economic growth still matters because sustained rise in GDP have been shown over the course of history to improve our health, our wealth, and our happiness. So suppose we have an economy that grows at around 5% a year, that roughly what its historic average has been over the past 75 years. GDP annual growth rate in India averaged about 5.87% from 1951 until 2020, reaching an all-time high of 11.4% in the first quarter of 2010 and a record low of minus 23.90% in the second quarter of 2020. Now 5% might not be sound like a lot, but that rate, when my children reach at my age, the economy will be nearly 5 times bigger than it is today. When GDP goes up, the economy is generally thought to be doing well. Meanwhile, weak growth signals that economy is doing properly. If GDP falls from one quarter to next, then growth is negative. This often brings with it falling incomes, lower consumption, and job cuts. The economy is in recession when it has two consecutive quarters, like let's say 6 months of negative growth. Following the global financial crisis that ignited in 2007, UK GDP fell by 6%. This market was deepest recession for 80 years. The impact on people's lives was severe, with large fall in wages, restricted access to credit, and many people losing their jobs. GDP annual growth rate in UK averaged around 2.33% from 1956 until 2020, reaching an all-time high of 9.8% in the first quarter of 1973 and a record low of minus 21.7% in the second quarter of 2020. Although most expected India GDP saw substantial contraction when the Ministry Statistics and Program Implementation (MOSPI) released the data for the first quarter, April, May, and June of the current financial year on Monday, the broad consensus was that decline would not exceed 20%. As it turns out, the GDP contracted by around 24% in quarter one. In other words, the total value of goods and services produced in India in April, May, and June quarter this year is 24% less than the total value of goods and services produced in India in the same 3 months last year. So, what is biggest implication? With GDP contracting by more than what most observers expected, it is now believed that full year GDP could also worsen. A fairly conservative estimate would be contraction of 7% for the full financial year. Since economic liberalization in the early 1990s, Indian economy has clocked an average of 7% GDP growth each year. This year, it is likely to turn total and contract by 7%. What causes GDP contraction and why hasn't the government been able to curb it? Let us see. The net result is what by on paper government expenditures share in the GDP has gone up from 11% to 18% Yet the reality is that the overall GDP has declined by 24%. It is the lower level of absolute GDP that is making the government look like a bigger engine of growth than what it is. What is the way out? Let us see. When income falls sharply, private individuals cut back consumption. When private consumption falls sharply, business stop investing. Since both of these are voluntarily decisions, there is no way to force people to spend more and force business to invest more in the current scenario. The same logic holds for the export and imports as well. Under the circumstances, there is only one engine that can boost GDP, and that is the government. Only when government spend more, either by building roads and bridges and paying salaries, or by directly handling out money, can the economy revive in the short to medium term. If the government does not spend adequately enough, then economy will take a long time to recover. What is holding back the government from spending more? Even before the COVID crisis, the government finances were overextended. In other words, it was not only borrowing, but borrowing more than what it should have. As a result, today, it doesn't have as much money.